Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. This is your host, MagMongoSlade. Today we're going to talk about Diamond Dallas Page and his ANE biography. And this one was probably the crappiest one of the bunch, considering they avoided anything that could be remotely controversial. They didn't talk about his WWE career at all. They basically just talked about his entire WCW run. And then they stopped when he won the world title. So they didn't even get into his whole WCW career. It wasn't terrible. It wasn't like it was a bad biography of Diamond Dallas Page. But this guy is 60 some odd years old. And they have his wrestling career basically going 6 years. He won the world title and then everybody went home happy. It was like, wait a second. There was some stuff that happened around this time. But okay, let's get into this. Let's talk about it a little bit. So they talked about his early life a lot, because the key point of this DDP biography is that Diamond Dallas Page is extremely positive and is a saint and saves everybody's lives. Even though that latter part might be true, they put some time putting him in the hole, saying that he had a tough childhood, he had ADHD, he had dyslexia, he was bullied. He lived with his dad after a divorce. His dad was an alcoholic. All this kind of stuff. He became a huge wrestling fan in 1977. Became a fan of Bruno Sammartino and Dusty Rhodes. And they inspired him to get into the business that he loved so much. And he got into it when he was about 22 or 23 years old. They didn't tell this in the biography. It's also not in the WWE biography either, to my knowledge. But in the book Nitro, Diamond Dallas Page basically says he came up with the name Dallas because he was a fan of the Dallas Cowboys. And of course, his real name is Page. And I don't know where Diamond came from. I don't remember. But that's basically how it was put together. So he wrestled in a promotion, I think some kind of indie promotion in Canada, as Handsome Dallas Page, and he got injured in his first match. And so basically he gave up on wrestling after he got injured. So they talked about that, and that was fine. They talked extensively about his time in nightclubs. The one time he did cocaine, tripped out, and wanted nothing to do with it. Seeing WrestleMania for the first time and meeting Jake Roberts and saying how, Jake Roberts was kind of bummed out that he quit on his dream and wanted Dallas to really get back into it, and how Terry Taylor and Ted DiBiase and all these guys kind of pushed for Dallas to get into the business. And they didn't mention that WrestleMania 6 Diamond Dallas Page was actually there. This was mentioned in his WWE documentary. WrestleMania 6 Rhythm and Blues, which is the tag team of Greg the Hammer Valentine and the Honky Tonk Man, they had a pink Cadillac for their entrance, and it was Diamond Dallas Page's Cadillac, and he was actually the driver too. So he is like Alexa Bliss and Charlotte and all them who were extras before they were on the main stage of WrestleMania. Diamond Dallas Page was that too. So they skipped ahead to him becoming a manager at 31 years old. He went to AWA because he had, I guess Vern Gagne had somehow gotten a tape of his radio show or his radio voice or commercials or whatever he was doing when he was doing the DDP character, the Diamond Dallas Page character, the good God, and all this kind of stuff. And Vern Gagne liked that. And in the book Nitro, he talks about going up there to manage the tag team of Bad Company, and ended up winning the AEWA Tag Team Championships and leading the Diamond Exchange. He was brought there to replace Paul Heyman, who was leaving AEWA in 1988. At this point, he started making some money. Eric Bischoff worked there too, and he actually became Eric Bischoff's neighbor. And this led a lot to Diamond Dallas Page's success in WCW. It's not mentioned at all, but it probably should have been, that DDP and Bischoff are very close friends and were neighbors for a long time. And DDP had the inside track on a lot of the success of WCW. For instance, they talked about in the documentary how DDP likes to help other people, and how he was, the guy who helped create the Diamond Stud, who ended up being Scott Hall, and how he tried to help Vinny Vegas, who of course was Kevin Nash. And how when those guys left, went to WWF and came back, they elevated DDP because they remembered that he had helped them. And that when Jake Roberts was out on his ass after a divorce, DDP let Jake Roberts live in his house, and they were study tapes and all this kind of stuff. And so Jake Roberts was helping him. And of course, Dusty Rhodes was his mentor and had inspired him to get into the business. They talked about all of that. What they didn't mention, though, is that he was Eric Bischoff's neighbor, and he had a really good inside track to Bischoff. He had a direct line to Bischoff. And Bischoff talks about this sometimes on his podcast when he wants to admit it, that sometimes DDP would pitch ideas either for himself or for other people, but he was always there. He was always in the mix. I was surprised they actually cut out one of DDP's favorite stories, is that how Randy Savage volunteered to put him over. Usually that's a story that DDP loves to tell. He tells it every time anybody asks him about it, but it wasn't in here. They talked about his feud with Randy Savage, but they didn't talk about, the story of Randy voluntarily putting him over and how that made him a big deal too. But I'm pretty sure Randy did that as a favor to like Hall and Nash and those guys. And but so they talked extensively about his WCW run. Dusty sort of inspired him to want to be the world champion. And if he doesn't want to be the world champion, what is he here for? Which, of course, is sensible and true. Like, why would you put your body on the line if you can't be the world champion? So they didn't talk about WWF. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit because I feel like you would be remiss to discuss Diamond Dallas Page and not talk about the WWF run. So he goes to the WWF in 2001. Oddly enough, in a very short interview with Slam Wrestling, DDP revealed that he was actually excited to be revealed as the stalker for the Undertaker angle. And later on, of course, once it was kind of soured and people unanimously hated it, he kind of turned on it too. But he's basically said that Vince didn't, and this was in 2009, so this was 8 years later after he told Slam that he liked the idea. He told Slam like he was trying to be respectful to Vince. He didn't want to come in and start any problems. So he accepted the gimmick. But he's pretty sure that Vince had never watched WCW and had no idea who he was, which is facts. I can almost guarantee you the first WCW match Vince McMahon ever watched was Booker T versus Buff Bagwell that happened on Raw. That was probably the first WCW match Vince had ever watched. But here's the killer, the real kick in the nuts. It turns out that DDP was on the same pay scale as guys like Sting and Goldberg, Hall, Nash, etc. And he had a huge pool of money that he could have gotten if he had stayed at home. And that huge pool of money was $500,000. Had DDP surrendered 500,000 of them fangs to go to work in WWF to be the stalker in the Undertaker angle, I would be very, very upset with Vince McMahon if that was the case. I would be very upset. If he could have sat at home and collected $500,000 from Turner, but instead he went to work at the WWF, and he said that's all he ever wanted to do. He wanted to be on that stage. And he basically said it a little bit later on because, DDP is ever optimistic, that he felt like him and Christian had the second best match at WrestleMania 18 after Hogan and The Rock. I don't know if that's true, but he basically said like that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to get on that stage. And at that point in his life, he didn't know how much longer he was going to be wrestling. So he basically just said, forget the money. I'll go on the platform to see how far I can go. And he didn't go very far, and it didn't last very long, and sooner or later it was over. But that definitely should have been in the biography because it's very important. But they decided to skip it out. Now, they did talk extensively about DDP Yoga. Essentially, they talked a lot about the resurrection of Jake Roberts, Scott Hall, but there's also incredible stories of him saving the life of Buff Bagwell, him improving the life of Mick Foley, and most recently, in 2024, there was a Butterbean documentary that came out that DDP put together because Butterbean was massively overweight. and couldn't really move. And he had to lose weight, I think, in order to get a hip replacement. And so DDP has really been doing God's work. And it sucks that he was a stalker in WWF. That's a terrible creative, by the way. Even I can't defend that. I like DDP. I've always liked DDP. I like DDP as a wrestler. He seems to be a great guy. But I have to say, every DDP in interview is pretty much the same. It's all commercials for DDP Yoga. And I mean, every time he talks, it's a commercial for DDP Yoga. There's cameras everywhere all the time. And he tells the same stories over and over again. So if you've seen the WWF documentary, the only difference here is I think Kimberly's in it. And I don't think Kimberly was in the other one. So that's really the major difference. This one barely scratched the surface, and that was the weak point of it. They really didn't go into any detail about anything. But it was solid, but it was certainly not the strongest one. And it's near the bottom in terms of WWE biographies. Right down there near Randy Savage. But let me know what you guys think. And I'll talk to you guys later.
Yeah. We just gonna